One thing my sponsor talked to me about at one point was when having like a step 9 conversation,
Hmm.
that you don't give any explanation, you don't give any context, you don't give any of the rationale or the reasoning. You simply say, this is what I did and I hurt you and I'm sorry. And so there's no like, I'm going to explain to you why this isn't actually really my fault. Like I have all this trauma, which might be true, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
What matters is that I hurt you. And I have had a conversation like that with with a few of my siblings, just with regard to, like, I came to realize that I have had a tendency throughout my life to distance myself when my siblings have children. And it's something that is related to a childhood trauma from when I was very young. And my dad had married my stepmom and they had my sister. And once they had my sister, it sort of seemed to me in my experience that a lot of the people who knew me had just like stopped coming around. And I think I made up a rule in my head that when there's a new baby, people leave. So the family can like become a family.
Hmm.
And then I just found myself doing that. And it came out in a conversation with a brother once. And I realized that that's what I was doing. And then I kind of realized why. And then I had to have that conversation with a lot of my siblings. But the conversation really was just like, I know I haven't been around and I'm sorry and I want to do better. I think I understand why, but that's not really what's important.
Hmm.
I just hurt you and I'm sorry and I want to be better, which sounds a whole lot different than. So I was in therapy and I discovered that I have this trauma and that's why I do what I do. Because it's just really hard. And we do the same thing when we go to confession sometimes
Hmm.
because we know too much moral theology. And so sometimes when we go to confession, we try to give a lot of context. So it doesn't seem as bad what we did,
Mm. Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. If you
Like
were
I
in
did this, I
rationalizing.
did this. I mean, I'm feeling rejected and this other thing happened and I committed this sin. Instead of just going, I committed this sin and I'm sorry and I don't want to do it anymore. And like the prodigal son doesn't sort of like come to his senses and then go back to the father and say, like I didn't really mean to do what I did cuz, like I got screwed by the world and they took all my money and like he doesn't really do that. He knows exactly who he is and he doesn't have any presumption at all that he'll be restored. Like when he says, I've sinned against heaven and against you, I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. He doesn't say like, will you let me back in the house? Can I call you father again? I don't really wish you were dead. He doesn't say any of that. He just says like, this is who I am and this is what I've done. And then he has this opportunity to be surprised by love.
Yeah, I want to put a
And
pin in that. I want to return to that story. I want to kind of even dive into it as, yeah, I think it's a great example of both, turning back and forgiveness, seeking forgiveness, and perhaps even forgiving ourselves in some ways. But what you mentioned before, though, like the rationalization, we might do this when we're making an amends. Beginning at step one, where we admit we are powerless over fill in the bank, alcohol, drugs, lust, food, sex, gambling, that our lives have become unmanageable. This is where we get, really honest with ourselves and directly take a direct look at what did we do and what were the
mhm,
consequences of our actions. And it was, the man who saved my life was very clear on a regular basis that I had stolen the peace of mind of the people who I cared about and who cared about me most. And not to let me forget that, but without, rationalizations. And then in step four, we're making our list of resentments, fears, sexual conduct. We're face to face in many ways with the direct consequences of our actions and choices. And then in steps 8 and 9, step 8, we make a fearless, uh, made a list of all persons we had harmed and become willing to make amends to them all. And then in step 9, make direct amends except to such people, except when to do so would injure them or others. I remember making the list of people that I needed to make amends with. And then before we made any amends, my sponsor had me write a do not send letter. This is what I'm going to essentially say when I'm making the amends, and share that with him. I'd bring back a couple each week. If this is what I'm ready to do, he would take out a red marker, cross off all the places where I was rationalizing my bad behavior or blaming other
mhm.
people. And it also makes me think of when, you just basic relationships. Like I remember very early, first few years of marriage, I feel like my wife and I, 5 or 6 years sober at the time, our arguments would all kind of boil down to the same thing. Our arguments per se, but just our disconnections would boil down to the same thing. Essentially it would be something like something that I was doing wasn't working for her. She would indicate that. And then I would, rather than just like really taking a look at the behavior, just look at the rationalization behind it. Yes, I've got this fear of abandonment and like these things of the past, and let's focus on that stuff rather than focusing on my behavior. And that was just crippling. There's no way to find any kind of like resolution or forward solution in that. Maybe listeners can relate, and it doesn't have to certainly be a romantic relationship, but it might seem as though all the kind of the disconnections, the challenges that we're having in relationships all seem to almost boil down to the same thing in the end. And we might even forget what was the thing that we were that really needed to be addressed. For me, maybe that was even a coping mechanism. Rather than taking a look at my behavior, let's look at the underlying causes and reasons, which weren't really underlying causes as much as they were rationalizations or excuse making. Back to the parable of the prodigal son. We read in Luke's gospel, Luke chapter 15. I don't know if we should read all of this, but I think that it's really important for context. In Luke 15:11, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed his pigs. He longed to till his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father." This was his preparation. He didn't just go to the father with like, "I'll just wing it when I get there," but was truly like did the internal work
Mhm.
in order to recognize like this is the wrong that I had done and this is what I need to really repent for. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." The father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate. Then it dives into the older son who was in the field, heard, called out. One of the servants asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has come back safe and sound." And the older brother became angry, refused to go in. His father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friend. But when a son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." My son," the father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So much of the story of recovery is packed within that. Whereas, usually it's some kind of human need that's not being met, that's a function or a consequence of our addictive, compulsive behavior. And we recognize that something's got to change, and perhaps it's got to start with us. And so, coming to our senses, we then perhaps, or maybe even slowly come to our senses through the process of repenting and finding